Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Þorger, and today here I am to deliver the third and final part of this short series on waterscapes in Nordic mythology. And now finishing with the Nykr, the metamorphic Nordic water spirit. It took its time, but here we are. You know, working abroad, a couple of projects here and there, house went kaput, family troubles, trying to find a new girlfriend, shape-shifting into a werewolf and going down into the underworld to fight against the forces that assail the crops and the very fruitful nature of the wild green earth, archaeology, working with some museums, trying to get some sleep in these past 34 years, but to no avail. You know, the usual stuff that gets in the way. But here I am to finalize this series, so better not waste any more time and go straight to the point. My dear friends, if you please. Well then, Nøkken, Nøkk, Nøkk, among other terms to refer to a particular dangerous and it would seem also seductive water spirit in Nordic folklore, whose shape and appearance is undetermined due to its shape-shifting characteristics. The water spirit called Nykr, metamorphic by nature, can take on the most diverse appearances, such as the form of a male human being, young, old, a musician with a string instrument, best be special careful with the latter. Can also assume animal forms, mostly a horse, but also the bull, ox, calf, pig, cat or fish. And even objects such as a silver platter and a pearl necklace, a watch, a copper bowl, and even half a boat. The stories about this folkloric creature are numerous and diverse, and it is a being that has been present in Nordic folklore for many centuries, with its roots in the understanding and perception of the pagan world, of course. Hence the reason why I have started this series precisely explaining the importance of water and waterscapes in Norse mythology and gods associated with that element. So, we have several tales about the Nykr, and there is never consensus regarding to its form. However, it seems that we always have at least three fundamental factors associated with this being: bodies of water, supernatural attraction, and danger. Nykr is an old Icelandic masculine noun that has two denotations of a fabulous or fantastical water being, usually appearing in the form of a grey horse, and the hippopotamus, from ancient Greek hippopotamos, river horse. It begs the question if either ancient Greeks had ever seen a horse prior to finding a hippopotamus, or what the heck were they feeding their horses to look like hippopotamuses? Now, this water spirit is quite common actually in Northern European folklore, that is, receiving countless names depending on the region, of course. In Germany, for example, there are the Niks, Nek, Nøkk, among other terms, Danish Njörðr, Swedish Nøkk, Norwegian Nøkk, among others. In Icelandic folklore, it seems that this water horse is called Nykr or Ninir, and that it can live in rivers, lakes, or even the open sea. Its appearance, although not the only possible one, mostly or more commonly resembles a horse, usually grey in color, but sometimes black as well, and has its legs turned backwards, turned back to front. It is a metamorphic being. It is recurrent that it appears as a horse, as I said, that presents unusual or stigmatized characteristics: turned paws, huge size, black, grey, or white color. Therefore, unusual features, be they deformations, disproportionate size, or colors in horses that would be stigmatized under the association of colors to particular negative things or visible signs or characteristics of a disease, bad omen, death, danger. You get the point. Any unusual feature on a horse could indicate that it was a Nykr in disguise. Basically, at least according to the sources I have studied to help me compose this video, all over Iceland people believed in the Nykr, so in almost every district there are stories of at least one living in this or that river or lake, especially those with strong currents, right? And then, of course, depending on the region or district, people would add characteristics, unique characteristics or features to the Nykr and its existence according to the environment. For instance, it could live in the sea and neighed whenever he knew that the people had gone to fetch a cow. The cows went absolutely mad at its neighing and flung themselves into the sea and so were drowned. This particular belief is especially noticed on islands in Iceland and communities living on such islands not before the middle of the 19th century did ever dare keep a cow on their island, so close to the sea and to the possibility of having the cows gone mad due to the Nykr, the neighing of the Nykr, and thus lose their cows. Bearing in mind the stigmatization and fear around this being, it is curious because not long ago I told you about the figure of the Exa, the malevolent witch in Swedish folklore, and in that video we are dealing with a topic precisely focused on the stigmatization of women and the fear of witches in a period of strong witch hunt, the witch craze, the fear of witches, and a deep fear around the conception of the pact with the devil. And of course, around all this fear are built new types of folklore, demonizing ancient folkloric figures, ancient figures of both mythology and of religious conceptions, and important figures not only in the understanding of traditional practices of magic and popular knowledge or folk knowledge, but also the roots of these understandings that come from the pagan world. So certain concepts still strongly rooted in popular culture are also demonized. So it is not strange to see that in Swedish trial records from the 17th and 18th centuries, they indicate that people could be sentenced to death for allegations that they had copulated or traded with nature spirits, among them the Nykr, precisely. Direct references to the Nykr as a water spirit date back to the 16th century at least. Once again, we are facing that pre-Christian understanding in which people formed symbiotic relationships with all sorts of supernatural beings, for lack of a better term, and such supernatural beings existing in the natural world and among humans, such as domestic spirits, nature spirits, etc., that with the progressive Christianization are eventually demonized, leading to the conception of the pact with the devil, as an example, as a pact or supernatural agreement made with the devil to gain magical powers, which is actually the demonization of the symbiotic relationships of an animist nature of a pre-Christian past. That's why the Nykr also eventually turns out to be a being that becomes, in a way, with a heavy negativity associated with it, which leads us to understand that perhaps in a more remote past it may have been one of the spirits of the natural world, in this case associated with water, with which or towards whom people would make some kind of offering or some pragmatic activity to establish a beneficial relationship with this particular spirit. I am not really saying that it was a spirit whom pagans would understand as a being related to something good in its nature. On the contrary, the most negative associations with this being may have been present long before Christianization, because as we see in animist societies, relationships are not created only and just with beings that are good by nature. Quite the contrary. Most animistic relationships with non-human beings, it is usually precisely with beings and spirits and entities that can cause some kind of damage, harm, sickness, and even death to the human community. So there is a need to establish beneficial relationships to avoid all kinds of harmful factors. Hence, the Nykr in a pre-Christian context could always have been a being that transmitted something harmful. After all, we are talking about a being, an entity, or a spirit that inhabits water or associated with water, and the fear of drowning, which, curiously, or perhaps not, it is a very general fear, as we can perceive by the various Nordic folklore tales or folkloric legends transmitted to us. So perhaps there was this need to establish a symbiotic relationship with the Nykr to provide something beneficial or to minimize something inherently harmful associated with this being, with this spirit. For example, to minimize drownings of humans or livestock, or both. And the types of behaviors to form and keep forming these relationships remain in folklore to a certain extent. Could be the offering of a piece of food to appease the river spirit, or the sacrifice of an animal or a person, some sort of pragmatic behavior in order to prevent harm, which, of course, such long-lasting behaviors within popular culture would eventually lead to an understanding under the Christian and mostly under the Protestant perception, an understanding to be an interaction with demons and evil spirits, or even with the devil itself, in order to have something beneficial from such entities and in order to acquire magical power, leading to people being accused of witchcraft and sadly condemned. Ballads about the Nykr are abundant and can be found in various folk collections. Nordic ballads about the Nykr fall under the category of ballads of the supernatural, or also known as ballads of mystical nature. It is something that I hope you can read to deepen your knowledge on this subject. It's quite interesting. There is a vast content of this genre present in ballads and records of judgment, witchcraft trials, and legends as well. Several geographical spaces with their own legends and tales about the Nykr, which I will not analyze here one by one, of course, because this requires a much deeper study and we do not have the time for that, because here I am giving you a more generalized and quite brief sort of introduction to this theme, this subject, which I hope will open up your appetite to explore more on this topic. We are here dealing with themes related to the rite, religion, and imaginary of agrarian Nordic societies in relation to aquatic surfaces. Despite the Nykr figure being something that, according to literary sources, appears to us already in the modern period, around the 16th century, but with a greater focus on this entity in the 17th and 18th century sources, we are still dealing with popular imagination, folk imagination, folkloric traditions, partly still rooted in a pre-Christian agrarian mentality and the perspective of the world with a still animistic character in relation to living with and within the natural world, with the natural landscape or the environment that surrounds human societies, as I tried to explain in the previous videos on this topic. To approach folkloric beliefs and analyze aspects of the imaginary of past peoples, it is necessary to investigate their technological, social, and religious context in order to discern their conceptions of reality. Understanding the Nykr in folklore requires understanding the worldview of the people who believe in it, and that includes the technology that was available to them. Technology that starts from the needs of the people for their survival, for their sustenance, which also leads to interacting with the natural world to obtain means of survival and sustenance. Human needs and the technology that provides the means to satiate such needs will ultimately shape the perception of reality, the world view, creating specific symbolisms and even shaping a metaphysical notion of reality. As I said in the previous video, the prominent ideas of Norse mythology in relation to water refer to wisdom, sacredness, seduction, and dangerousness. Bodies of water, therefore, tended to evoke some of these ideas, as did the fantastic beings that resided in there. Despite historical and regional variations, prominent themes from Norse mythology can be found in 19th century Norse folklore still. Of course, the cultural context can be reconstructed to a certain extent, and well, for that, sources and studies from different areas about the rural life of a certain people are necessary. The study of folkloric material requires interdisciplinary work. That's why we are going to briefly have some considerations about agricultural history, or the history of agriculture, and technological advances in Sweden mostly, and Scandinavia in general, at least from the Iron Age to the 19th century, in order to contextualize the agrarian life that animated or gave life to the Nykr in legends, folklore, and stories. So, here we go. For some of you, this part might be a little bit boring. You thought it couldn't get any more boring? Oh, my sweet summer child. It's important to understand the evolution of the agrarian environment because all the changes and techniques that allow humans to exploit natural resources has a great impact on the collective mentality, which in turn shapes folklore associated to the agrarian life. Associations between human activity with environment are important organic parts of our lives, and cognitive and emotional habits will structure and shape our way of thinking, our worldviews. Which is why, when it comes to folklore, instead of dying out, it transforms itself gradually into something different in order to accompany the evolution of the social realities of populations. Well, the development of Nordic agriculture, like in any part of the world, was not constant or uniform. There are always important factors to take into account, such as environmental and political factors that vary in each region and each period. But there have been periods of significant technological change and advancement, but there have always been periods of stagnation and decline as well. Actually, the agricultural production strategies that brought about radical changes in the ways of life of the Nordic populations in this case would only take place from the 20th century onwards, with the advent of artificial fertilizers and fossil fuel traction. I will focus on Sweden just for a better understanding, a bit generalized of course, but it serves as a good example, I think. From the history of agriculture in Sweden from 800 of the Common Era to the year 1000 of the Common Era, we come to understand that agriculture was influenced by changes in social political structures and processes that had a profound impact on production, settlement patterns, and in the landscape itself. These advances not only contributed to the formation of Swedish social structures, but also reflected local preferences for certain techniques. Therefore, let's say, the first millennium before the Common Era can be characterized as a period of agricultural expansion that resulted from a complex agrarian technological set, such as the confinement of cattle, introduction of hay meadows, manuring and removal of stones from fields to provide a sort of flat terrain for a more extensive agriculture. In approximately 500 of the Common Era, Scandinavians followed the trend of Northern European countries in adopting the agricultural system in which cultivation and cattle raising occur simultaneously. Scandinavian became part of an agricultural system of mixed farming, which for 2 millennia at least was to dominate a wide belt from Ireland in the west across the northern half of Europe. During the period of 200 of the Common Era by 600 of the Common Era, there were a number of changes in agricultural technologies and practices, although the considerable increase in the implementation of iron tools for farming and harvesting began as early as 200 before the Common Era, obviously. Various forms of sickles and leaf knives dated to 200 before the Common Era up to 200 of the Common Era were found in Sweden. To be more precise, over 260 iron sickles and leaf knives used to gather leaves for fodder have been found in Sweden, mainly as grave goods. The particular sources I've studied say that due to the small sizes of these tools, it suggests that they were used mainly by women and children. Although in these studies it seems to me to be a bit of a misogynist commentary by certain historians who automatically assume gender based on certain activities and also on the size and shape of utensils. Actually, we may be in the presence of smaller objects for particular activities that require a more thorough work regardless of gender. Or we are perhaps simply in the presence of small-sized objects as representations of the real agrarian objects, just as symbols, a symbology, representative of the real thing to be carried as symbology to the afterlife, into the afterlife, since these have been found in graves as grave goods, precisely. But anyway, the gender struggle is something constant in the academic world. Well, funerary archaeological finds from the Viking Age also illustrate diverse models of sickles, pointing out that such objects would also have relevance in the religious imagination. Remnants of the long metallurgical tradition and aspects of the imagery of the ancient Norse peoples survived in the 19th century folklore through objects used in apotropaic rites against the Nykr, as we shall see further ahead, don't worry. Now, both agricultural intensification and technological development took place within the parameters of a stratified society, a society in which political power and influence still lay in the hands of the landed class. A social hierarchy, right, of settlements is structured that can be divided into four major classes: small houses, medium-sized farms, farms with long houses capable of confining cattle, and chieftains or lords' farms. Such divisions, which became more evident in the 5th and the 6th centuries of the Common Era, influenced the later formation of local political centers, which belonged to the third class, and also centers of worship, commerce, and military organization, which fit into the fourth class, class 4. In the 8th century, changes in the agrarian landscape were more related to new social structures than basic changes in agricultural practices and land use. Unlike previous periods, cultivation and settlement became more sedentary and concentrated on better soils. In the late Iron Age, 550 to 1000 of the Common Era, the Swedish agrarian landscape approached those of medieval models of the European continent and was characterized by the increase in the use of iron for agricultural utensils, which contributed to greater efficiency in harvesting cereals. At the end of the Iron Age, circa 1000 of the Common Era, changes in construction techniques, among other factors, resulted in the occurrence of smaller houses instead of long multi-purpose houses or multifunction houses. I must point out that the decisive introduction of a new technological complex in Denmark took place from the 11th to the 13th centuries, which would influence the other Scandinavian peoples. The establishment of new techniques proceeded from the economic change that the Nordic countries faced after the Viking Age. After a period of intense invasions, raiding, looting, and paying tributes and killing a whole lot of people, the Nordic peoples started to produce and move their economy in a more regional way. Between the year 1100 to 1350, we noticed that the peasants had already emerged as the most important agricultural sector in Denmark, and that in the 15th century they constituted effective units of production, even after the epidemic crisis. They were responsible for the export of grain and livestock, for instance, to northern Germany and Holland in the 14th and the 15th centuries. And until the 16th century, the interest and influence of lords in agriculture was almost insignificant. Well, no longer with a tremendous impact as in previous periods. Until the 19th century, we can say that the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden, can be defined as agrarian societies. It is not until the mid-1800s that we see a process of transition, right, from classical agrarian society before industrialization, and then later in the late 1800s we see the process of industrialization leading to a classical industrial society from approximately the 1860s and the 1870s. It is precisely here that I wanted to get, because the vast majority of legends and folklore about the Nykr, appear precisely in this second period or middle period of the agrarian world in Scandinavia. That is, in the transition period precisely, a period of great social insecurity. So, analyzing agricultural development in Sweden as an example, from the 1700s to 1850s, we identify factors from the agricultural revolution that took place between the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, such as the establishment of property rights, trade liberalization, and successive investments in human capital. These factors contributed to the effective growth in agricultural production and acted as prerequisites for the subsequent industrialization process. So let's try to understand the relationship between these changes and folklore. The period preceding industrialization, the second half of the 18th century and especially the first half of the 19th century, is characterized by changes in several spheres and considerable social stress and tension. Pay close attention at that. Faced with the emergence of new social classes, such as the proletariat, new organizations gradually emerged to represent and meet the interests and needs of vulnerable groups. State and religious institutions, as well as industrial sectors, took steps to deal with the growing problems of an unprecedented lifestyle these societies were facing. In the early 1800s, ancient traditions and norms were challenged, and the social mobility from one generation to the next was more often downwards rather than upwards. With industrialization, people's lives changed quite a lot. Their norms changed, their traditions. There was this rapid change hard to accompany from the part of the population that for centuries had lived in a classical agrarian society. Folklore mirrors social changes, and in the case of the Nykr, in folklore, this water spirit, it is translated into, or rather, it reflects anxieties and change of values and traditions and stress of this period of transition. It is precisely through folklore that we gain an understanding of the historical, social, cultural, religious, and biographical contexts in which folklore is generated and perpetuated, because there is a set of factors responsible for sustaining a worldview. Although tales about the Nykr, the water spirit, exist in pre-industrial periods, of course, obviously, these legends about the Nykr continue to be transmitted and created and reshaped, adapted and remembered in the cultures of the Nordic peoples during the 19th century, even after great social transformations. Now, according to the variations of the legends, it is possible to identify some ritualistic, moral, and religious aspects that governed the imagination of those that shared this cultural background. It is therefore not uncommon for folklore to reflect social and religious aspects of ancient times. Rites, rituals, cults, religiosity, morality, and myth, the analog cognitive processes prevailed in the interpretations of pre-industrial societies and can be understood as coming from the social imaginary and the respective cultural construction at a given moment. It is possible for rites to remain somewhat stable even after changes, great changes in cultural interpretations, especially when it comes to strong emotions, feelings that stand out in the collective thought of human societies. And for this reason, legends related to death, disaster, or imminent danger constitute folkloric interpretations in the face of unexpected or feared situations and, as such, give rise to rich cultural heritage about historical worldviews. These kind of feelings associated with human thoughts are more likely to prevail. Now, on the subject we are dealing with here today, it is common for legends to present a mixture of remnants of the imagery of the Old Norse belief systems with strong Christian influences. Such influences in turn acted directly on the way the water spirit would be interpreted, resulting, for example, in its characterization as an essentially negative and, at times, demonic being. Even though we are faced with the same folklore creature, a metamorphic water spirit, there are at least three versions of the Nykr that can be distinguished in Norwegian folklore: the Nøkk, Söetrold, and the Grim, just Grim, or Fossegrim. The first version, which refers to the Nøkk, which would inhabit rivers, lakes, and fjords. It would take on various appearances, like half a boat on the water or half a horse on the bank of a river, or even as gold and other material goods. It could also take on the appearance of a black dog. With the exception of the apparition in the form of a black dog, which is something rarer reported in folklore, in Nordic folklore, the appearances assumed by the Nøkk would be attractive to the individuals of this time period in which we see a great deal of folklore and legends concerning the Nykr. The horse, as well as the gold and the boat, which mark advantageous material possessions, plow, transport, and status. Don't forget we are dealing with an agrarian society at this point still, so the means to cultivate the soils, own property, means of transportation to deliver goods and exchange of goods and buy or acquire goods, and power and wealth, status, key elements within an agrarian society that are the basis of a prosperous economy, or to achieve such. This spirit, the Nøkk, would assume attractive forms intentionally, as the direct contact between it and the victim would result in the latter's submission to the former. That is, from the moment the victim touched or mounted this spirit, the victim would be under its dominion. From this way of operating, taking a certain form to attract to attract and subjugate people, it is understood that there is a cultural relevance in the forms taken by this spirit according to the mentalities of the time. As mentioned, in a pre-industrial agrarian society, the horse is a valuable animal for its strength and ability to make labor activities more practical, in addition to enabling long-distance journeys in less time. And the same thing for the boat. The role of the horse in Norse mythologies points out that the horse occupies a central role in the myth, religion, and practical life of the Indo-Europeans. Horses play roles as anthropomorphic supernatural beings, distinguishing them from other animals which do not usually act independently. In Northern Europe, as in so many other regions and cultures obviously, the horse carries multiple values both in the practical and symbolic spheres. So, in the legends of the Nøkk, in horse form, if a person were to ride the spirit in horse form, the horse would run towards a body of water, or a river or a lake, making it impossible for the victim to dismount and leading to death by drowning. There are cultural elements that reinforce the symbolism of this folkloric construct, but it is also interesting to consider the behavior of the animal in question. We are dealing with a natural attitude of the horse, which seems obvious, right? Attempting to dominate a horse often results in the horse running away, especially if it is a wild horse or a lost or lonely horse without rider, just wandering about. In the folklore, the Nordic folklore, legends as well as in reports, the victims always try to immediately mount the horse that appears to them. which may indicate a forced approach, right? As a result, the animal would run away. The Nøkk's appearance and behavior similar to an unruly horse or a wild horse does not necessarily imply that folklore arose from events of this type, but it does indicate that such legends have spread in a social familiar environment in which this type of animal behavior was well known. Human interaction with horses is certainly also a factor to take into account that led to part of the construction of the figure of the Nøkk. We must also bear in mind that in Western cultures, especially post-Christian, animals that stand for ill-boding, melancholy, and wicked intent are numerous and often appear under the color black. In this case, not just the horse, but the dog as well as another form the Nykr takes on sometimes. There is an association between dogs and the color black with death, which is present in several ancient mythologies. For example, Kerberos in Greco-Roman mythology, Anubis in the Egyptian mythology, Fenrir in Norse mythology, etc. Such an association persisted in the social imagination through the centuries, including legends collected in Great Britain during the 19th and the mid-20th centuries, which evoke apparitions of black dogs with frequency, actually, as if they were phantoms, wraiths, ghostly spectres carrying bad luck, misfortune, and even death. The reference to the Nøkk as a black dog is particularly interesting. For instance, in the British Isles, the black dog was already a fairly consistent folk motif. In English folklore, black dogs act as bringers of death and haunt inhospitable roads, instilling fear in lonely and weary travelers. In Swedish folklore, practically likewise, the appearance of the black dog was also frowned upon, feared even, as it was interpreted as an evil or demonic spirit, a bad omen. Now, according to folklore, also, Satan could assume virtually any appearance it wanted, obviously, and that when it assumed non-human forms, the black dog was its most popular appearance as well. This appearance adopted by the devil is common in Christian folklore around the world. Folklore about the black dog serves as a common ground between distinct cultures that were Christianized, such as in this case, the British and the Nordic. Both cultures in question would share the symbolism of the black dog as a bad omen. Although the dog usually symbolizes fidelity, loyalty, it also has a demonic nature in popular or folk belief. I didn't make the rules. Dogs characterized by burning eyes, black color, and enormous size are often considered evil spirits. Now, returning to the Nøkk, the water spirit, some accounts tell us of a Christian religious figure, usually a priest, who is responsible for putting an end to the evil that the Nøkk does, especially the deaths caused in waterfalls. I think it becomes obvious that the figure of the priest occupies a central place in the solution of the fatalities and problems caused by this creature, indicating that, in this case, only a church authority would be able to identify and fight the evil water spirit. Thus, the clash between the priest and the Nøkk would be of a dualistic nature, good versus evil, placing the Nøkk as a demonic creature. We are not only dealing here with the possible demonization of places that were once considered sacred in a pagan past, especially in the Western European imagination, right? The western half of Europe, especially linked to bodies of water, and certainly not just the demonization of local entities and deities related to place and water. As I said before, even in pre-Christian times, in an indigenous animistic past, there was already a belief in spirits that were not beneficial, and various interactions of human populations or human communities with these spirits were necessary to prevent any type of negative factor that could compromise security and the lives of human populations. Usually, we are talking about an intermediary figure, a mediating figure, like a shaman, whose function is to establish relationships with the spirits and both prevent harmful factors and also establish symbiotic relationships for a more effective survival. This figure develops and eventually becomes the figure of the sage, sorcerer, healer of popular culture. In the case of Sweden, as I said earlier on the video about the malevolent witch, these figures bearers of great wisdom and magical power and serving as intermediaries between humans and spirits were the wise ones, kloke folk. In a way, the figure of the priest, a Christianization of folklore, continues to serve as an intermediary figure. However, giving power to the church as the ultimate organ of authority over the religious and the profane, and authority and control over the supernatural even. But the folkloric tradition and the intention, the thought and the habits, the rites, are still there. The Nøkk's habitat would obviously be aquatic, and therefore its appearance is in the vicinity of water bodies or bodies of water. This context surfaces or arouses one of the prominent ideas of the cultural construction of the cognitive landscape of water, which is often associated with or understood as a dangerous and deadly element and environment. Water has been invested with a significance which went beyond its essential functional role for survival. The Nøkk enhances the danger of water, especially for children, who are identified as its main victims. In a way, these types of stories also serve as warnings to prevent children from moving away into unknown areas and wild spaces and drown, right? When we are children, we are not aware of danger until it is too late, unfortunately. So folklore tales also serve as a didactic means to avoid death by unconsciousness in the face of natural dangers. Right, the infant mortality rate has always been quite high. It should be noted that, for example, 90% of the Norwegian population lived in rural areas, very remote areas in 1801. The national infant mortality rate in Norway was 177 per 1,000 born in the period of 1751 to 1755, while from 1806 to 1810 the rate rose to 204. Of course, although such data does not completely clarify the legends and its variations, it is admissible that the high infant mortality rate in the period in question contributed to the characterization of the Nøkk in Norwegian folklore as a supernatural being eager to take children, since it is portrayed as an evil water spirit which induces death. We should also point out that this being, this spirit, would only be especially dangerous only after sunset, which reinforces the characterization of the night as a fearful period of the day in popular belief. Also associated with waters that at night become more dangerous due to the poor visibility, and the fact of the high infant mortality that often occurs at night due to the various problems that newborns are subject to at times of the day when parents cannot supervise, usually when they are sleeping at night. For me, as an example, these fears are easy to understand, and in a way it's easy to understand this projection of fear and insecurity onto folklore. I grew up in a remote village with a lot of dangers, especially precisely in terms of water. Waterfalls, rivers, streams, wells, abandoned wells, and lakes and swamps and bogs, and there was a high infant mortality, both because of the dangers of the natural world and the lack of natural defenses and economic difficulties in more remote and rural areas. Two types of rites are identified in Nykr legends: sacrificial rites and apotropaic rites, the latter being protection from evil spirits. We understand here a sacrificial rite as a religious action that, through the consecration of something or someone to a deity or spirit entity, aims to influence it in the sense intended by the offerer, either to establish or to maintain or to restore a satisfactory relationship between it and the human or the human group that offers. Now, the Nøkk would require a human sacrifice each year, according to legends in Norway at least. This belief would justify the disappearance of at least one person in the vicinity of each river or body of water inhabited by a Nøkk, which allows the interpretation that the sacrifice would not be a voluntary social rite, but an action performed by the water spirit itself. The occurrence of sacrificial rites in Scandinavia dates back to the Mesolithic, obviously, and of course had different purposes and involves living or inanimate beings. During the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, sacrifices in swamps, bogs, wetlands, and lakes seem to have been a typical ritual expression of southern Scandinavia, at least. Until the migration period, fertility offerings were common and carried out in places far from the settlements, but later cults and sacrifices began to be performed in central places such as a chieftain's or lord's farmstead, which fits into the last social hierarchy class of settlements previously mentioned, the fourth class. Based in archaeological findings, the objects sacrificed in fertility sacrificial rites from the late Roman Iron Age had character associated with everyday life and are generally related to agriculture and daily life of an agrarian society. Given the proximity of sacrifices to community structures later on, it is assumed that the sacrificial rites would occupy a central role in social practices being carried out collectively with the objective of strengthening identity ties between individuals. Various types of blot, Old Norse sacrifice, which illustrate the religious and cultural relevance of these rites in social events, especially in yearly events and festivals or festivities. In the case of the Nøkk legend, sacrifices would be performed in their habitat, namely rivers, lakes, and fjords. When any person is drowned, the Nøkk is often heard to cry in a hollow, unearthly voice, "Seed over." Crossover. It is curious to attribute voice and word expression to a supernatural creature, especially a commanding voice, which reinforces the Nøkk's ability to subdue its victim. The description of Nøkk's voice, characterized as hollow and unearthly or supernatural, attributes judgment on such a creature, and it gives us a negative impression of how the Nøkk should be understood. As for the Apotropaic Rites, almost forgot, Apotropaic Rites against the Nøkk. As folklore suggests, on approaching a body of water, one should say, "Nikk, nikk, nål i vatnet, Jomfru Maria kastet stål i vatnet. Du sek flit. Nikk, nikk, needle in water, the Virgin Mary cast steel onto water. You sink, I float." You bloody bastard! We are dealing with rites that have their own logic, with their origins in the popular imagination, the folk imagination, which in turn is expressed mostly through symbolic language. In this case of the Apotropaic rites against the Nøkk, this particular vocal expression for protection, the logic involves the belief in the effectiveness of pronouncing Christian names. The Virgin Mary and Jesus as two examples, quite common actually in evocations and spells of Scandinavian traditional magic, especially Swedish trolldom. And of course, together with metal objects, obviously. Such elements would be able to serve as protective elements against water spirits, which had the potential to act in an evil way. Regarding Christian references, the differences between Christian conceptions and folkloric conceptions regarding the potential of sacraments, prayers, and the instruments of Christian worship are particularly non-existent. As for iron and other metals in general, its use as a protective amulet against evil creatures or spirits is not unheard and certainly wasn't something new to 19th century Nordic folklore alone. ancient Germans, the old Germans and Scandinavians used amulets which could be of animal, vegetable or mineral origin, but most commonly they were made of metal. Archaeological remains from the Viking Age have shown us amulets of this type, right? Although for different religious purposes, archaeology has also identified deposits of metal objects along with sacrificed animals dating back to the late Mesolithic. Sorry, the late Neolithic. I have already spoken about amulets on another video, so no point in digging further into this. But we must emphasize here that the improvement of the metallurgical techniques of various human populations had an impact, a tremendous impact on the level of importance and increase on the value of forged objects in different social spheres, including the religious scope. Metal objects and sacrifice were two features present in many rites and rituals of various peoples, including Nordic peoples, of course, for centuries, usually as part of a funeral rite to guarantee a good passage to the other world, to the afterlife, or with the intention of, or to appease, or the intention of appeasing deities or nature spirits. The needle is one of the metal objects specified in the legends of the Nøkk. Along with that object, the Apotropaic Rite also invokes speech directed at the Nøkk, warning it of, or that the Virgin Mary threw a metal needle into the water. This procedure would prevent the Nøkk from acting, that is, preventing it from causing death by drowning, especially towards children. It is important here to refer to a social economic issue. You see, low technological societies rarely have a division between functional and ritual activities, unlike our modern societies. Nowadays we have access to all sorts of instruments, so the value of such objects are quite different to us, and an object for a specific function for us nowadays is only used for that function alone. So for ancient societies, in which several utensils, several practical objects would have had a much greater impact on people's lives, and to the object several functions would be given due to their tremendous importance. So cult activity also becomes a functional activity, since it is performed with the clear aim of producing something. So it may not make much sense the case of a needle here present as an apotropaic object, but the functions for which it has been created in a period of time in which needles weren't so easy to come by wouldn't simply restrict the use of the object to those functions alone for which it has been created, because it was important, it was rare, and it was made of metal, and metals serving as powerful protective mediums. So other magical religious functions would be given to the needle and other functional objects as well, because they played important roles in people's lives. It was part of their daily activities, through which something important was constructed, which would ensure survival or economic growth, or both. The importance of certain objects would bring them into the magical religious panorama as well, because they were important elements in people's lives. It's a question of mentality and the value people give to something, to the point that certain objects become more than objects. If we find multiple uses for an object, even functions that come to act as substitutes for other objects, the object becomes important and it is used for as long and as much as possible. Besides, needles play a fundamental role in the making of clothing, rugs, I guess, blankets, other functional objects that serve as protective objects against the natural elements. So by itself, the needle and human intention creates protection. And it is this creative thought that is expressed through association onto objects. As said before, there is the Söetrold, which would be another name by which the Nøkk would be known, the Nykr, in Norwegian folklore. The description of the appearances it assumes under this name is quite interesting, as well as the ritualistic particularities as they indicate variations of Norwegian legends. It appears that the Söetrold is portrayed as having many heads, multiple heads, right? Appearing as a large horse with monstrous hooves that would stir up storms. Whenever it is stormy or a tempest is gathering, this being appears in the form of a large horse with its monstrous hooves splashing in the water, constantly creating a violent motion of the waves. The relationship between horse and storm associated with a destructive character is not unique to the Söetrold. We see these characteristics precisely in the Old Norse god Óðinn, who in a transformative cultural process would have given rise to folkloric versions of the Nykr, the Nøkk, the water spirit. Óðinn assumes the name of Nykr or Nykr when he acts as the destructive or evil principle. In this character, he inhabits the lakes and rivers of Scandinavia. He raises sudden storms and tempests and leads humankind into destruction. Here's one of over 100 reasons why I don't understand some neo-pagans and some neo-heathens assume Óðinn to be an all-benevolent fatherly figure. We have a relationship between the names of Óðinn and the Nykr. Nykr, the character of Óðinn as a god of the sea. In Beowulf, frequent mentions occur of the Nykr. Connected with the name is that of Óðinn, precisely, Nykr, in his character of a sea god. In Gylfaginning, one of the texts of the prose Edda, there is a brief description of who Óðinn would be, including mention of several names he would receive, among them Nykr and Njörðr. In another excerpt from Gylfaginning, Njörðr and Njörðr are also among the names attributed to Óðinn. These things are sadly overlooked. If I'm not mistaken, Óðinn has 170 nicknames, but most would have been invented by the skalds from a new image, or from a new conception and perception of this god and god during the early Middle Ages. With the progressive contact with Christianity since the Scandinavian Iron Age, Óðinn begins to have many names associated with the Christian god. If the names listed here, such as Nykr, Njörðr, and Njörðr, were created in this period, this could indicate that the transformative process of the god Óðinn in a water spirit would have started already at this time, at this period. Óðinn, among its many domains, magic, war, wisdom, poetry, death, necromancy, etc., and so on and so forth, presents an aquatic facet as well that can be identified in mythological sources. Although such characterization is a theme that is sadly often not studied precisely because of a greater focus on other aspects of Óðinn. I've already talked about some associations between Óðinn and water, the sea, drowning. In another video I made precisely about the water environment in relation to the afterlife. But we have other examples of these aquatic facets of Óðinn. For example, in Óðamál, there is an emphasis on the control that Óðinn exerts over waves. Óðinn is able to control the wind and, consequently, the sea itself. Furthermore, one of the nicknames of this god, referenced in Gylfaginning, is Vidrir, which means weather god, also further connecting him with the ability to control storms. In addition to weather god, it is assumed that Óðinn would also be an expert horse tamer under the name of Kjalar, another nickname of Óðinn, who tamed horses very well according to 11th century skaldic poetry. Let us not forget that Óðinn is, of course, associated with Sleipnir, an 8-legged horse, and together they form a symbiotic set that goes beyond the relationship of owner and domesticated animal. In Norse mythology, the use of animal figures is not at random, as you well know, and they often symbolize characteristics associated with the deity they accompany. Óðinn and Sleipnir, god and horse. The roles of god or deity and horse could sometimes be merged. Some myths and some names for the god Óðinn suggest that people thought of this god as having horse-like qualities. Thus, the following elements interact in the complex identity formation of this god: horse, destruction, storm, water, and destruction and death. Such elements are also present in some characterizations of the Nykr, especially in its version as Söetrold. Supernatural ideas are adapted and transformed into new social and cultural settings. Given the etymological references here presented, Njörðr, and the relevance of the Óðinnic cults, which often involved horses, sacrifice, and lakes and the sea, it is assumed that the Nykr developed from mythical beliefs rooted in ancient Norse religiosity, culminating in the form of a water spirit in 19th century Nordic folklore. Another feature that accompanies the Söetrold version of the Nykr is quite interesting. An offering of a son or a daughter to this entity to bestow benefits on the person that is offering one of its children. If people are in danger of shipwreck, they must promise the Söetrold, a son or a daughter, to be released from this imminent danger or imminent death. In this sense, a Söetrold would probably be responsible for causing the shipwreck itself. For a son or daughter, the spirit of water in turn will bestow something beneficial and good luck as much as they wish to whoever they choose to force upon the victim the sacrifice of a child, the sacrifice of the lineage. This particularity of the offering of a child brings the Söetrold closer to the god Njörðr in terms of rites carried out to entities in the aquatic domain, as Njörðr is also presented as a supernatural being to whom one must pray to for good sea voyages and riches. It is indeed possible to the continuation of certain mythological aspects which can be maintained through radical change in religion. Perhaps the rite performed for the Söetrold, in this case the offering of a son or a daughter, provides specific ideas that refer to sacrifices that were dedicated to Njörðr, the sea god Njörðr, the god of the oceans, such as the promise of the lineage of a person itself, which would guarantee a gift, a beneficial outcome, or a beneficial relationship between the supplicant and the entity. Oh, I wish we could go back in time and live in the olden days. Everything was so much simpler and beautiful and good. Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, taking into consideration the mythological and literary sources, representations of these gods and the water spirit demonstrate a cultural construction of the perception towards the water landscape, which is perceived as a provider of wealth, but also of destruction and death. Óðinn, Njörðr, and the Söetrold share the domain of the water and, in this way, incorporate the aquatic environment itself, its characteristics, right? Offerings would be made to appease the deity responsible for the control of water, for incorporating elements of the environment to which it was associated in the religious and folk imaginary. In the Nordic context, the offering or sacrifice made to the water spirit would have the purpose of claiming benefits, even saving lives to a certain extent, in the face of dangerous circumstances such as storms, shipwrecks, and whatever negative contact with water surfaces. Each ritual would have its particularities and would be effective for each specific purpose. Another version of Norwegian folklore, and quite widespread actually in Nordic countries, concerns the Fossegrim, as said before, also known as Grim, simply Grim. It is a variation of the Nykr legends with particularities quite different from the Nøkk, yet similar to the Strömkärl of Swedish folklore. The Fossegrim, like the other versions of the Nykr, is a male water spirit, but it is specially characterized by being musical in nature and inhabiting waterfalls and mills, mill works, right, near bodies of water. There are no specifications about its shape. In general, this spirit plays music on calm, dark nights to attract people to it, very romantic. On Thursday nights, it can teach you to play the violin or some string instrument, provided that the person offers it a white child or a young white goat. I had difficulty with the translation. The sacrifice of a child is not unheard of, as we have previously seen, but specifically referring to the skin color of a child for this particular old folklore, I have my doubts, and I think the likely scenario is the offering of a white goat, actually. Given the fact that we are talking about a being that lives in waterfalls, the most likely is the sacrifice of a goat. In this case, a young white goat. This because it coincides with one of the oldest Icelandic folktales about Thorstein, one of the first settlers to inhabit Iceland, who worshipped the waterfall at his homestead. And he sacrificed to the waterfall and in turn receiving and maintaining the gift of foresight. The very night Thorstein died, all his sheep drove down into the waterfall as a last sacrifice. Therefore, in the Fossegrim legends and folkloric tales, there is the following composition of the sacrificial rite. The subjects who act, those who do the ritual, the sacrifice, those would be aspiring musicians or already musicians who intended to improve their skills. The subject of the sacrifice would probably be the young white goat. The place would correspond to the proximity of waterfalls, and the time would be during the night period, especially on Thursdays. Thursday is one of the most recurring days in Norwegian and Swedish folklore, especially dealing with traditional magic, traditional folk magic. Every single reference of Thursday in Scandinavian folklore concerns the workings of the underworld and human interactions with subterranean or underworld entities. In Scandinavian late Iron Age, Thursday was the day dedicated to the god of thunder, Thor, which is precisely from Thor's name, Thor, that Thursday comes from. Medieval legends already give us the idea of a pact with the devil on Thursday nights, precisely. According to these legends, the person who wanted to make a pact with the devil should write a contract containing the conditions for both parts, every detail, signing it with their own blood and leave it in a churchyard on a Thursday night. Now, the form of sacrifice would be to throw a goat from a waterfall or a child, which should be done with the face turned away, right? Which may indicate that direct contact with the spirit of the water was taboo. To whom the rite is intended would be the Fossegrim, of course. And the intentionality of the action would be to obtain unparalleled musical mastery of a stringed instrument. Some features such as sacrifice and Thursday nights are also present, of course, in Swedish versions. Regarding the legends of Nykr in Sweden, it is said that the water spirit was described as a very musical being and that people could learn to play a musical instrument from it. Usually the violin, fiol, but also the accordion, dragspel, or the flute, flute. To do so, the interested person should go to a river or stream for 3 Thursday nights and on the third night perform a sacrifice, for example, a black cat or 3 drops of blood. In Swedish folklore, we have specific days and periods when the Nøkk, the Nøkk, but for Sweden it is the Nøkk, when the Nøkk appears. The particular time at which Nøkken appeared were experienced as dangerous and charged with anxiety. In several accounts, specific days and times of the day are mentioned, including Midsummer Night, the night before St. Lucy's Day, 13th of December, the night before St. Thomas Day, 21st of December, Christmas Eve, the New Year's Eve, and the nights before Thursday and Sundays. These times can be considered as temporal boundaries. If you remember a more recent video I have done concerning moments of the year considered propitious to acquire magical power according to folklore, and the video I have done about the year walk, Horsgang, Here we are in the presence of auspicious days of the year, which, according to folklore, are days to obtain magical power or some skill obtained by or through otherworldly or supernatural means. The continuation of certain local pagan rituals is attested by numerous examples of offerings to spirits deposited on Thursdays and at sacred times of the year. The rites, the rituals, and beliefs related to the Nykr, although affected by Christianity and, of course, other influences from other regions and cultures and religions and peoples, refer to conceptions of the old Nordic religiosity still, with regard to relationships with nature spirits and in the rites of how to deal with such beings. We are in the presence still of Nordic animism. These entities may or may not accept what was offered to them, of course. This can be illustrated by the extent of the gift granted by the Fossegrim. If the offering is mediocre, the spirit would not transmit the musical secrets in their entirety, in their totality. Hence, generally these legends and folk tales refer to the sacrifice of children and animals, being elements that arouse a strong emotion, usually a negative one, generally against moral and ethical values. And for that very reason, the acceptance of these sacrifices and in exchange giving some kind of gift is established not only by the element of sacrifice itself, but also because of the personal sacrifice, which is usually much more than one usually has the courage for. Or perhaps the deed is done due to the lack of consciousness. As this video is getting too long, in another video I will only address the Nykr in Swedish folklore, mostly concerning the Nøkk and the Strömkarl. That future video will be an attachment to this video, and thus we conclude this topic finally. Be attentive. Until then, thank you for watching. Thank you for your patience, support and friendship. My dear friends, as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell.